So the key thing with this chapter is being able to link how environmental policies will impact growth, and the distinctions between the short term and the long term is really, really critical for environmental policies because they're very different, and if you neglect to talk about either the short term or the long term, then you won't get full marks. So in terms of the long-term impact of environmental policies, the idea is that by helping to preserve our productive capacity and improve our environment, they can lead to increased aggregate demand, and that's because of the idea of having lower prices and improved supply-side potential. So if we can reduce the incidence of natural disasters, we can keep agricultural productivity higher, firms will be more willing to produce, and it should lead to higher national output and increased GDP. So in terms of economic prosperity and living standards or any links to aggregate supply, clean energy legislation or the carbon tax and the emissions trading scheme should help to protect economic growth and living standards in the long term. But in the short term, it can lead to a decrease in material living standards because particularly the carbon tax is a tax. It will lead to higher prices of goods and services. It's also a tax on producers, so it's going to make them less willing and able to supply, particularly less willing because they're going to be making lower profits. So they're getting taxed on their production. That's quite costly. That's bad for aggregate supply in the short term. It also reduces purchasing power and is bad for equity. But in the long term, the idea is that it can boost our productive capacity for two reasons. One, more efficient renewable energy is often cheaper to run in the long term once the initial startup costs have fallen, or once you've taken into account the initial startup costs. So that can lead to lower costs of production as well. But it also leads to reduced pollution and reduced incidence of natural disasters and negative externalities that can hurt our productivity going forward as well, as the price mechanism starts to shift resources to more renewable energy sources. So in terms of linking the short-term impact on aggregate supply, it's important that you recognise that these taxes or these permits are forcing firms to internalise these external costs, and they will lead to higher production costs in the short term. Regardless of whether the businesses continue to use carbon, if they do, they'll be paying a tax or buying more permits, which is costly. Or if they do decide to invest in more renewable energy sources, it does take time to restructure, and that can lead to significant costs, significant outlays in the short term if we're buying the infrastructure and buying the machinery necessary to implement more renewable energy. So firms may be less willing and able to supply in the short term, and that can basically lead to higher prices as they're covering their costs. It can lead to reduced purchasing power and increased inflationary pressures. So in the short term, it's really important to recognise that the carbon tax will slow down economic growth because costs of production are higher, and this can lead to reduced aggregate supply and reduced economic growth. In terms of the long term, these policies should help to prevent Australia from the devastating effects of climate change. So they should protect our natural resources and make sure that our infrastructure is not affected. And because it helps to preserve these resources, it'll help keep production costs low for firms, and it reduces the incidence of things like natural disasters and droughts. It'll keep increasing our access to water. It'll protect our wildlife, and therefore should lead to an improved ability to supply in the long term. So by halting the damaging effects of all of these things, it'll help to keep our aggregate supply at sustainable levels and make sure that the economy can provide goods and services for its citizens. And it's also important to note that renewable energy is often cheaper to run, so that can help lower firms' costs of production as well. That's really all. Just as I said to you, really important that you can distinguish between the short and long-term impacts, and that idea of reduced incidence of disasters which can make firms more willing and able to produce.